So, can a Bible scholar actually prove Jesus mythicism completely false? Can they prove that the Jesus that Christians require is actually real, or worthwhile, or not the silliest, most absurd thing imaginable? Yeah, I wouldn't be holding my breath if I were you, because this time we're going to go with a requested video, and it's not a pretty picture. So let's go dive right in. This time out, we're going to take a look at a video suggested by Your Nightmare, for which I'd like to offer my thanks. If you have a video that you think I ought to take a look at, then by all means, send it my way. This one comes from Canadian Catholic, and he wants to tell us why Jesus mythicism is a problem, yet I don't think he's going to be as successful as he seems to think he is. So let's go take a look, and if you see Your Nightmare in the comments, be sure to say thanks. Anyway, away we go.
What is the best evidence that the historical Jesus actually existed?
Now, as I typically do these kinds of videos, I usually weigh in with my own views at the very beginning. And in this case, there is simply no evidence for a real historical Jesus, especially if you're talking about the magical, miracle-doing man-god that rose from the dead and ascended into heaven that the religious say is described in the Bible. There simply isn't anything there. Now, the religious tend to think that the Bible itself is proof, but that's not true. The Bible is the claim. It doesn't actually prove anything in and of itself. You'd have to go back and prove the Bible is reliable and independently corroborable, and yeah, good luck getting the religious to do that. So let's see what his expert has to say.
I don't know if there's one piece of evidence. I would just have to say that it's a combination of the fact that we have so many little pieces.
And what are those little pieces? Be specific and expect me to ask you to back up all of that independently, because I'm going to. But before he goes on, I want to remind everyone that the religious, all of the so-called experts and apologists, they rely on the fact that the people that they're talking to, the people that are watching this podcast or whatever it is, those people are not likely to be critical of the faith-based nonsense that he's spouting. He's going to say something about the Bible. You can bet on that. And his audience are going to say, "Oh, right, the Bible, we already believe that." It's why apologists work the way that they do. They're just pandering to an already believing, gullible audience because they know that audience is not going to ask any difficult questions. Again, this is why they don't talk to us. It's why they're not publishing in scientific peer-reviewed journals, because we aren't going to let them get away with this stuff. But anyway, onward. I'm hoping this actually has a point.
Okay, so what are the little pieces that, when combined, form a good
Okay, first to the Apostle Paul,
who never claimed to have seen Jesus pre-mortem. He had a drug trip on the road to Damascus, and that's it. You might believe it, but that doesn't make it so. Anything that Paul had to say about Jesus is entirely irrelevant because it doesn't prove Jesus actually walked the earth. It's an article of faith, not demonstrated fact. And this is exactly why I automatically eject faith from any rational discussion. Faith doesn't prove anything. It doesn't get you anywhere. Anyone can have faith in anything. There are people out there right now, people that you can go talk to right this second, who have absolute faith that little green men shoved probes right up their asses. That doesn't mean that it actually happened. There are people who will tell you they've seen the Loch Ness Monster. that doesn't mean a thing. There are people who think they've talked to ghosts and seen big hairy creatures running around in the woods, and none of that is at all impressive until they can produce objective evidence to support it. So let's get away from faith. Faith gets you nowhere. Let's try some evidence for once. Good luck on that.
Paul did not know Jesus personally, but he seems to have known people who knew Jesus. Paul writes his letters around the year 50. So that's 20 years after, let's say, the death of Jesus.
First off, let's get this straight. He claims to have known people who he claims knew Jesus. None of that is demonstrable. Claims in a story are not the same as objective truth. I can claim anything I want. Also, keep in mind that at the time all of this was going on, the average lifespan at the time in and around Palestine was only 30 to 35 years. That's it. It's the same general age that you get in classical Rome or classical Greece. If you were really wealthy and you had the best doctors of the day, you might get a little older, but mostly that's about all you got. So how exactly did Paul talk to people who supposedly knew Jesus if virtually all of those people would have been dead a decade or more before Paul came on the scene? Who are these people, and how do you know that these stories are true? That's something the religious don't want to address. Secondly, you don't even know that Paul existed in the first place. Now, someone clearly wrote the books attributed to Paul, although we know that the same person didn't write all of them. All of the things that church tradition slapped Paul's name on, they couldn't have been written by the same real historical Paul. In fact, there are no records of any Paul or Saul outside of church tradition at all. There are no independent records of this Paul guy in prison or anywhere else. For all the religious know, Paul was just made up. Certainly, someone wrote the various books that bear his name, but they have no idea who that might have actually been, just like most of the rest of the Bible.
But Paul seems to become a disciple of Jesus, if we can kind of read between the lines in his letters, mainly in Galatians. He seems to have become a disciple of Jesus very early, maybe around the year 34 or 35, which would have been only 4 or 5 years after the death of Jesus.
Again, if you believe any of that. If you have to read between the lines, you have no validation that it actually happened. And that's really where all of this falls apart, if you notice. The religious start with the conclusion, and then they go looking for reasons to think it happened the way they want to believe that it did. They don't follow the evidence to the most logical and rational conclusion. They already know where they want to go. Of course, all of the hard questions they just ignore because they're inconvenient to the faith. Why challenge your preconceptions if you don't have to? So they talk to people who don't really care about the truth so long as they get their fee-fees catered to, and if they're even aware of these questions at all, they simply ignore them because, why tempt fate? And they definitely don't talk to anyone who's going to hold their feet to the fire. Because they don't have answers for any of this. None at all.
And he knows people like Peter and James and John, people who were the disciples of Jesus during their lifetime, during Jesus' lifetime.
Well, that's the story. Now prove that it actually happened the way you describe. Because I've talked about this before. Paul, or whoever wrote Galatians, claimed that he went to see Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. Well, isn't it convenient that neither Peter nor James nor anyone else who was there corroborated this tale? Because how handy is it for someone to come along down the road, someone who has his own ideas of what God is and what Christianity should be, to claim with zero evidence in support that they met up with the big names, people who may or may not have even existed at the time, and got their seal of approval? How do you prove any of this happened? And what does it mean even if it did? Because those are some great questions. Too bad the apologists don't want to address it.
And he talks to them. So Paul is one of the earliest evidence of knowledge of Jesus. And it dates back to 34, let's say.
Again, church tradition, not evidence. I would argue that if any of this was going on, we should have seen lots of other people writing about it at the same time. Yes, most people of the day in that area, they were illiterate. They could neither read nor write, but clearly, whoever wrote Paul's works, they were writing to early churches, and there had to be someone there who could read them, right? It's why most of these letters were read in church services. That was the whole purpose. So why do we have no letters from those churches, say, to any other churches saying, hey, I got this letter from this Paul guy? He's just asserting that any of it happened in 34 CE, when the first copies we actually have of anything Paul supposedly wrote comes from sometime in the 2nd century. Now, I know he wants to pretend that it comes from earlier. I just want him to prove it.
That's just 4 years after Jesus' both death. But then, all 4 Gospels have different details. It's not like there's one Gospel that all the other Gospels use. Mark's the earliest, but Matthew and Luke have other materials that they're getting from other places. The Gospel of John has other materials he's getting from other places. And I think the Gospel of Thomas, which is not in the New Testament, I think it has some sayings of Jesus that probably go back to the historical Jesus.
Except, once again, you have no clue where any of that came from because all of it is purely anonymous. Lots of elements between the various Gospels are directly contradictory to the others. I don't care about your faith. I care about your facts. And in this instance, your facts suck. This continues to be the reason they refuse to talk to us, because we're going to point out all of the problems that they have, the things they can't just bring themselves to admit to. It's why historians require such rigorous standards for determining that something likely actually happened, and the Bible doesn't meet those standards. It's why the religious are so far off base.
In other words, we have Paul and 5 different books that have evidence about Jesus.
No, they have claims about Jesus. There's a difference. Just because you like the idea that they say what you want them to say, just because your faith is somehow rationalized by the crap you make up in your own head, that doesn't make any of it actually intellectually defensible. The religious have a very, very low bar for credibility. If it gets them where they want to go, they'll go along for the ride. If it doesn't, they'll just make up stories about why it doesn't count. Whereas rational people have a single consistent standard, and we don't make exceptions. It doesn't matter what you feel. It doesn't matter what you want. It matters if you can meet the bar, and the religious simply can't. And that's a problem whether they're willing to admit it or not.
Now, what do you have to, decide, again, it's Occam's razor. What's the most logical thing? That one person invented all this and then it was just copied among different people?
No. There may very well be a kernel of truth at the very center. Maybe there was one person or a small group of people at the very beginning from whom these stories ultimately sprang. There could have been a real-life Jesus. We just don't know. I think it's hysterical that these lunatics are citing Occam's razor and then suggesting that maybe some magical supernatural being is a much more reasonable explanation than, shit got changed over time. Because we have examples of the latter and absolutely none of the former. But this isn't about what is the most reasonable position to take, after all. It's all about feelings and emotional comfort, and that's a damn fool's way to form your position rationally. Because who the hell cares about rationality anyhow, right?
Or is it more likely that there was a historical Jesus, and different stories about him circulated, and different sayings that he supposedly said circulating. And that's why we have them in a lot of different sources, but we have them in different forms.
That's possible too. I've never said that there couldn't have been a real person at the center of the myths. That's a person, not a god, because we have no evidence for any gods whatsoever. So sure, if that's the story you want to go with, I'm completely on board with you. The problem is, we don't know anything about this supposed person. We don't know anything about what they actually said, because they never left any direct records. They never said anything for themselves. All we have are these anonymous sources that say what this supposed real Jesus said. Well, how do we know that's true? And regardless, what difference does it make? Because the story of a real person is not the same thing as the story of a supernatural man-god. It's when you start pretending that makes all of the supernatural horseshit real that you've taken complete leave of your senses.
If we had them only in one form, then you might say that some person wrote it. I think, for example, I'm not a believer that the Book of Mormon is authentic. And part of the problem is it's too much alike.
Yet, you will find a lot of Mormons claiming that there are multiple eyewitness accounts to the crap that Joseph Smith supposedly did. The problem is, none of those stories stand up to critical scrutiny any more than the shit in the Bible does. Again, this is why we have a single standard and why they run around with the goalposts. They are not honestly trying to find the truth. They're trying to rationalize their way to an emotionally comforting conclusion, whether it has anything at all to do with reality or not. This expert, while he might be knowledgeable, he's doing the exact same thing that the rest do. They're allowing the things they already believe to influence the data that they've got. It leads to cherry picking and special pleading and all of the other logically fallacious nonsense that the religious are infamous for. It's why they're such fucking jokes.
It doesn't have the messiness of history. But the New Testament and early Christian traditions about Jesus, they have the messiness of history, which means that there's probably something historical back there that gave rise to a lot of oral traditions. And those oral traditions got shaped and shimmied and written down in different ways. That's the best explanation for the data that we have.
I'll tell you what it isn't. It isn't some magical man god that rose from the dead and did miracles. And I find it funny that a lot of these people will hold very conservative positions. It might suggest that there was a real Jesus. There could have been a kernel of truth at the center of it all, which I don't think most people really disagree with. And then they just explode into a flurry of irrationality and demand that because it could have had some historical elements, that all of the things that their faith demands are now automatically true. Yeah, not so much. I'd be fine if they just stop at the point that they have any evidence for, but they don't. I have no problem thinking that there could have been something from which the oral traditions began. That doesn't make it a god. The second you give in to blind faith, you've taken all leave of your senses.
In other words, it's just like every historical thing. You start with your data. What's the best explanation for the data that you have? And the best explanation for the data that we have from Paul, the 5 earliest Gospels, and other traditions about Jesus is that there was a guy back there who existed. Now, as I've said, we're going to argue about who he was and what he said and what he did. But I just don't think there's any way, in spite of a couple of scholars, and I only know of a couple of scholars who deny his actual historic existence, and I don't respect them as historical scholars either.
Your respect isn't required. All that matters is the data. Now, people like Richard Carrier, and personally, I think he's a complete asshole, but I think he's got some pretty decent arguments on this subject. Really, I think a lot of these people are just talking past each other, because a lot of what I see Carrier and Robert Price and a lot of the others saying, it isn't that there couldn't have been some vague, undefined person that could have given rise to some of the stories. They're arguing that the man-God Jesus is completely unsupported, and in that, they're absolutely right. This isn't something to argue over. It's a matter of the strength of the data, and no theist anywhere has enough to be convincing to anyone who doesn't already take the claim seriously. If you don't start from the Christian perspective, the idea that the real Son of God was ever real and living on the earth, that whole thing is absurd. You can't just leap to that conclusion because that's what you want to believe. You actually have to prove it.
But
Just before you continue, would you say that that list that you don't respect includes Dr. Richard Carrier?
yes,
I see.
he's probably the most famous.
So you wouldn't say that you respect him as a scholar?
No.
Big deal. I mean, I don't respect him as a human being either. I think he's a vile sack of shit. But his scholarship seems pretty decent. I also don't respect William Lane Craig, but this has nothing at all to do with the scholarship he promotes. It's just that the scholarship he promotes is typically pretty complete garbage. So let's limit the character assassination here, shall we? It has nothing to do with the facts, and that's really all we ought to be concerned with.
He's not a historian.
That's really interesting. Okay.
Cal State Berkeley and Columbia University would seem to disagree. Whether you like it or not, he has a BA in history, a master's in ancient history, a master's of philosophy, and a PhD. Your opinions don't mean a damn thing here, and anyone who would simply interject their personal opinions and deny that those degrees even exist, that person makes themselves entirely suspect, which I don't think anyone's going to disagree with. You don't have to like him. I don't like him, but you can't pretend that reality doesn't exist.
All right. Well,
even people who don't believe anything religiously about Jesus, like Bart Ehrman, or just name them, Dale Allison, they think it's ridiculous to deny that he existed. And they're not arguing as Christians. They don't believe it.
Which still doesn't get you anywhere remotely close to the kind of Jesus that Christians require. All of this is purely academic. Who thinks what doesn't matter. This isn't a cult of personality. This is about the evidence, and whether you people like it or not, you just don't have any. Now, the Canadian Catholic didn't have a whole lot to say here, and that's probably a good thing, because most things I've seen from him have been painfully stupid. Granted, it's all blind faith and wishful thinking, but that's really all he's doing. It's really all he pushes. It makes him happy to think that this garbage is so screw caring whether any of it's actually true. It's pure fee-fees. And that's dumb. It's why I don't take any of these idiots seriously. I don't care about your faith. I care about your facts. I care about what you can demonstrate with objectively verifiable evidence. Got any of that? Or are you just trying to spin what little you can come up with so it fits your preconceived notions? 2 guesses which one is accurate. 2 more whether or not these people actually give a damn. That's really why I have so little respect for the religious. And I'll be honest, my respect doesn't mean a damn thing. What does is the evidence that they can produce, and I'm sorry to say, they can't actually produce anything at all. It's all spin and empty claims and dumb people stroking their own overactive egos and just assuming that they've got to be right because they want to be right. None of that actually helps their position. It's completely put up or shut up, and they don't know how to do either one. It's why they're such ludicrous fools. Maybe they ought to knock that off.
Boom, boom, bum.